Hey everyone, thanks for joining me on the Slice of Healthcare podcast. I'm your host, Jared Taylor. Today I'm here with Panna Sharma, the president and CEO at Lantern Pharma. How are you today?
Jared, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
I'm excited for us to chat. I think we should dive right into it. It'd be great if you could give the audience a little background on yourself, and then we'll talk about your company.
Sure, thanks, Jared. I joined Lantern almost 3 years ago now as president and CEO. Lantern Pharma is part of a wave of a number of new companies that are using AI and data to help discover or develop medicines, drugs, therapies. And I'm sure your audience has heard a lot about the use of AI in either finding patients or diagnosing patients or coming up with new molecules. And we're one of those companies who's focusing on gathering data and using machine learning to basically develop or rescue cancer medicines. And so we have 3 programs. When we went public, we have 8 today, 2 in phase 2, the rest all in late stage preclinical.
And can you talk us through, thank you for the quick intro. I'd love to dive more into the company as far as I focus on these 3 things, right? And you already mentioned a little bit of this, but the why, how, what, right? Why did the company start to begin with, which you already gave us a little bit of info on that. How do things currently work at the company? And then if you had to give a quick 1 to 2 line description, what does that look like? And then we'll go into some of the topics you and I wanted to chat about today.
Great. Yeah. So our mission our mission at Lantern Pharma is to develop cancer medicines faster, better, and cheaper. And we think the only way to do this is by using data and AI. And so AI, every other industry that it's touched, it's been able to totally crush the product development cycle and allow the end consumers, in this case, patients, to get all the benefit, whether it's touched retail, financial services, supply chain, tech. The use of AI and machine learning has taken product cycles from here down to here. And it's actually increased the pace of innovation. And so one of the areas that is going to be next impacted most is going to be drug development. We've already seen it with COVID-19. And one of the most expensive areas, unfortunately, is cancer. Cancer drugs take $1 billion to $2 billion to bring to market, take 10 to 12 years. But the ironic thing is the core of this is cancer really is a data problem. Can we gather enough data about the cancer, about the individual, about the molecules in question to make a prediction of where and how it'll work? And that's what our AI platform does. Our AI platform has grown nearly 30x since we went public 15 months ago, less than 15 months ago. And it continues to grow. And as it grows, it's able to give better and better predictions around which molecules will work best in which cancers based on the genomic or biomarker profile. And we believe that's the only way to take a process that is $1 billion to $2 billion and cut it down to 100 million or 50 million. And if you can do that, those savings pass on to the healthcare system and they pass on to patients. And so that is a big part of our mission, is that we think that AI can be used for good, but most importantly, the good is making precision cancer therapy a reality. You can't do it today. You just don't have enough medicines. And at the pace that we're developing medicines, it will take 50 years. We can't do that. We believe that AI has the power to do that in a decade. So that's our mission. Our mission is to be part of that new wave, that renaissance of medicines driven by a whole new approach.
Well, you just mentioned this a little bit in that description, but I want to touch more upon this. What, in your opinion, what can we expect from the future of AI in cancer treatment?
Yeah, so I think AI is touching the whole process. And so I think it's very important for your listeners to know that we're focused only on a small piece, which is the development of the drug, or understanding the molecule, and also understanding which patients will benefit from it. AI can be used to diagnose patients. It can be used to monitor. It can be used to predict patients. It can be used to do imaging. All that stuff is going to happen too, but we're focused on this very narrow early part, which is predicting what molecules will work best in which cancer. And today, for your listeners, if you remove all the cytotoxic agents and the chemotherapy agents, there's only about 89 approved targeted cancer drugs. And yet there are nearly 1,000 different types of cancer that we know about today. Each one's so different. molecularly different. So how can we make precision oncology or personalized medicine a reality when you only have X number of drugs, but you have 9 to 10X number of diseases? You can't. And so you've got to have more therapies. You've got to have better therapies. There's so many subtypes of cancer where there are no approved therapies, and they're using existing drugs without a lot of benefit. And so the problem that we're trying to solve is twofold. Number one, there's so many great molecules and drugs that fail late stage trials, but they're effective somewhere. They work somewhere. So how do we tease that out? How do we understand the molecular mechanism or the patients most likely to respond? And how do we rescue those drugs or revitalize them? And we have 2 drugs in our portfolio that have gone through that process. But then also, as we learn new things about cancer, new genomic features, new biomarker issues, new insights, can we use those insights to then develop new molecules, new drugs? And we have 4 or 5 molecules in our program that are de novo, totally new. And so we think that process has typically taken, to develop a new molecule has taken, unfortunately, close to 9 figures, $50 to $100 million typically. And we've brought that down in our process down to maybe a few million. Massive change. And so in a year's time, since we went public, we were able to launch 3 new indications, 2 new molecules in 1 year, which is an unheard of pace of productivity for a drug company. And so that's just one small company, but there, our peers around the world that are using AI and data are at the same kind of pace. We are seeing a tremendous pace. And when you have all these new molecules, you'll be able to get more across the finish line. And therefore, we think the next decade we'll be able to bring the price of developing therapies down significantly. And when we do that, it becomes less a burden on the healthcare system. And at the same time, innovation goes up. And that's really this is ultimately what building great new companies is about, is more value to your end consumer or end patient and lower cost.
It's really interesting because we had the CEO of ChenMed on not too long ago, and he was talking about basically, and I might butcher this, but basically, if you look at GDP and if you made the United States healthcare spend GDP like its own separate country, right? It's like in the top 5 for highest GDP in the world. That's just the healthcare portion. So when you talk about being able to kind of lower prices through this avenue, that's super interesting for everyone that's listening, because our healthcare system is super expensive here in the US, and we need to continue to find ways to reduce that cost. So that really resonates with me.
Yeah, and one of the very important things, Jared, is that differentiating between price and cost. So we face potentially in the future an innovation squeeze in this country, in the US. We're looking at this year probably is the first year where new drug applications and investigated INDs launched. China might outpace the US, even with our own FDA. So we have to press the pedal more on innovation. And so for a lot of people, you're right, healthcare costs are very high in this country relative to other countries. And there are a whole host of issues that are way above my influence or pay grade to solve. But what I do know is that in medicine and in cancer, it's less of an issue than we make it out to be. And so, cancer medicine, the bigger issue is the out-of-pocket for many patients that are cancer patients is anywhere from 3.5 to 5 times more out of pocket, causing a lot of personal distress. And having visited cancer patients and talked with a lot of clinicians, the number one thing oftentimes many patients are stressed about isn't their own life. Unfortunately, it's the financial distress and potential bankruptcy and the economic uncertainty for their family. And I would love more than nothing else than to remove that significantly. But if you use nationwide data, and this was a study done by some folks at Dana-Farber, and the mean expenditure for cancer patients out of pocket was a little over 4 times higher than for normal patients. So and it was approaching like $17,000-$18,000 out of pocket on top of all the insurance costs. So you can imagine 2-3 years of therapy and going through the rounds of treatment can leave families very, very vulnerable. And so I'm a big proponent of using data and AI to take what takes $1 billion and bring it down to 100 million. Every other industry has done this. So financial services used to cost 10 cents a trade. It's now 1/100th of a penny of a trade. For me, I don't know for you, but basically, when I was in grade school and high school buying t-shirts and jeans and maybe shoes, they pretty much cost the same today as when they cost as 30, 40 years ago. I mean, maybe I'm not buying the right stuff, but I mean, you could buy a $30 shirt in the 80s, and you can buy a $30 shirt now, they're probably the same, or actually it's probably better today, the quality. And so you think about every other industry, price points have remained fairly flat or they've been crushed. Semiconductors, financial services, but why not in drugs? And that's because we have a lot of processes that need to be changed. One is we have to do more with machines, and we have to work 24/7. And so if you think about labs, every day all their people leave, all of the tremendous intellectual power that we have in those facilities leaves also. And so you want to capture that. And the only way to do it is through machine learning and AI. And so, we've seen tremendous increases in productivity as a result. And I think over the next decade, you'll have an era in which medicines are made more efficiently, more shots on goal, more successes, and therefore lower cost. And those lower costs will allow us to cap the percentage of our GDP healthcare takes up. But again, if you take a look at just at drugs, the percentage of GDP is significantly lower. So, one is healthcare costs, but second is drug costs. And if you even look at the Medicare numbers, the top 80% of the Medicare spend on therapies is taken up by less than 100 drugs. So, if you really want to slice into like, where should we fix the problem? Again, my number one thing is I think if we're trying to fix the problem when the drug's already approved and it's out the door, it's already too late. It's kind of, you're trying to like scoop water out of a hurricane-filled house. It may help, but it's not going to ultimately prove successful. So knocking off a drug price from $9,000 to $4,500, okay, yes, it'll save a few tens of millions or hundreds of millions, but we're talking problems that are in the hundreds of billions. And so I think there are much better ways to align incentives around pricing, around cost, around innovation for improved therapeutics, and more importantly, to allow the citizens of the US and of this country to participate in the upside. The NCI and the NIH have funded, according to studies, nearly 40% of new medicines have come from projects funded by those agencies, which are tax dollars. Yet all the benefit goes to venture capital and private equity. There's no participation, no pool, no downstream. Let's gather all the dollars from the innovations and make that available to people who suffer from those diseases. So I think there are a lot of incentives that can be done as we rethink kind of our role in innovating. But I don't believe in putting artificial price controls, because that ultimately will slow down innovation at a time where we need more innovation. We're like at a cusp right now where innovation is so accessible. You could do innovation now today in a way that you couldn't do it before because of data, computing power, availability of capital, availability of talent. So I think we should be pushing the pedal on innovation in this country to remain in that number one position, as opposed to creating barriers. So, but I think with you, I do believe that expenditures and the burden of cancer therapies should be reviewed closely. And I think there are a lot of areas for improvement.
Well, let's shift focus real quick to, and we're not getting political here for listeners out here. We're just talking about a pricing plan. Let's talk through, you and I were talking about this a little bit, President Biden's drug pricing plan. Maybe what's missing from it and how can we take more steps to reform?
Yeah, I think, again, this is, echoing a lot of what other people in the industry say, is that I think it's the general intent around pricing reform is a good one. I think, you've got to take a look at what the government pays and making the most for our citizens. I'm a big believer in that. But again, the devil's always in the details. So if you take a look at pricing, some pricing of medicine might fall by a few $1,000s, and areas like arthritis or maybe in some cancer. But again, it's only a handful of drugs. But Medicare beneficiaries would save probably an average less than $500. And so to me, is that really going to change? Is that really going to change our personal incentives? Probably not. Is that really going to change the overall budget? Probably not. So my view is that, like others, the impact of the policy change is unclear to me. But there are ways to modernize payments to generics and biosimilars, and at the same time, improve innovation in this country. It's unclear to me why most of the generics and biosimilars or biobetters have to be made outside this country. So we should create plans in which we accelerate reimbursement to generics and biosimilars, but also allow them to be brought into the market faster and cheaper. I also think that taking a look at pricing for Medicare post rebates is really important. So a lot of drug programs, especially in diabetes or other areas, have drug rebates and other incentives. And so Medicare thinks it's paying here, but really after rebates and ultimate cost, it actually ends up paying about the same as everyone else, if not higher. And so I think there needs to be modernization of what kind of data gets fed back to Medicare. And then ultimately, I think, improving negotiations really ultimately shouldn't rely on what other countries pay. It should rely on kind of what is the value to our citizens. And so if you look at that, you can look at the formularies and see, okay, what are the drugs that are being paid for, and do a detailed analysis. Like I said, the top 100 drugs or 80 drugs, top 200 drugs make up about 80% of the spend. So why don't we look at specifically where are they being properly used or not used, and how do we improve that area? But I think all of those are way downstream from what the ultimate issue is, which is how do we contain and participate in the upside of the innovation. And the only way to do that isn't to artificially cap pricing, but it's to participate in the innovation. I think citizens in this country should get upside in the way their tax dollars are used. And also, and I know this is part of one of the things that no one ever wants to talk about, but the gain the government wants isn't going to come from just their pricing on drugs. So if you take a look at all the other pricing around cancer, the drugs make up less than 30, maybe 21% of it. You have hospital visits, you have physician care, you have ambulatory services, you have X-rays, you have radiation treatments, you have the whole stack of activity. That whole stack of activity needs to be looked at and said, okay, how much are we going to spend on triple negative breast cancer? How much are we going to spend on prostate cancer? How much are we going to spend on a certain category of prostate cancer? And look at it. And that requires interdisciplinary or cross-functional teams. It is very easy to beat up on drug pricing, very easy. But usually you only have a handful of culprits. And so if there are issues where drugs are increasing faster than the rate of inflation, or if you have a drug that's 20 years old and should be made cheaper and cheaper, and yet it's increasing, yes, those things should be looked at, and we should avoid abuses. And I'm a number one believer that no one should rest on their laurels and just increase pricing for no reason. But again, those typically are exceptions. That's not the rule. The vast majority of my colleagues, we want to continue innovating, creating new things that are even better than the last thing that we made. And so that incentive should not be taken away. In fact, we should find ways to promote it even more. And ways to do it is to do more work here in this country. Ways to do it is to compress the bureaucracy of regulatory agencies, is to compress the cost to file paperwork. I mean, you'd be surprised how much it costs to file paperwork. You think it's free. Press a button and you file it with the FDA. No, it doesn't. You have to go through an intermediary. They're put in a certain format. They're going to charge their 10K here, 5K there, 2K there, $3.50 an hour here. Why? I'm not sure. I don't even ask questions because that's not my area. But regulatory is such a burden. And I'm not sure what the incentive back to citizens or for cancer patients are. So I focus on what I can focus on, which is, creating new chemistries, creating new clinical trial programs, focusing the science, focusing the people. But we have to take a look at these areas of costs that are artificial that should be brought down, because all that adds up. And so my view is we need to push the pedal on innovation. We need to allow citizens of this country to participate in the innovation, and we should allow economic incentives to keep more innovation, job, and activity in this country. And that'll more than make up for a few $billions of excess spend in certain therapeutic areas. And the area that I know best is cancer. And if you take a look at the top 10 drugs paid for by Medicare, 3 are cancer. So there's a lot of other areas also to look at.
Well, Panna, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, and I hope we can have you come on again, because I know there's other topics that you and I would love to dive more into detail on. I think you segmented at the end really well into that kind of last thought for a future episode too. So really appreciate your time today. Can't wait to have you on again real soon, and wish you all the best.
Jared, thanks a lot. Appreciate you having me.